The Meridian had been traveling the same route for 6 years without incident. Captain Daniel Price stood on the bridge, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the stars streak past the viewscreen. At 47, he had the look of a man who had seen both the best and worst of what space had to offer. His gray-streaked hair was cut military short, a remnant of his days in the Terran Defense Force before he'd retired to the merchant service. "How long until we reach the relay station, Kate?" he asked without turning around. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan glanced up from her navigation console, her fingers dancing across the holographic displays that showed their position in relation to the established trade routes. At 32, she was young for a first officer, but her sharp mind and steady nerves had earned her the position 5 years ago. 4 hours at current speed, Captain. We're making good time." The bridge of the Meridian was functional rather than luxurious. The cargo hauler had been built 30 years ago, designed for reliability rather than comfort. But the crew had made it home, filling the spaces with personal touches and the easy camaraderie that came from years of working together in the black. In the engine room 3 decks below, Chief Engineer Patrick Hayes was humming an old song as he calibrated the plasma injectors. At 54, he was the oldest member of the crew and had forgotten more about ship systems than most engineers would ever learn. His hands, scarred from decades of working with hot metal and live circuits, moved with practiced confidence. "How's she running, Pat?" came a voice from the doorway. Hayes looked up to see Dr. Lisa Morgan, the ship's medical officer and xenobiologist. At 28, she was the youngest member of the senior crew, but her enthusiasm for learning about alien cultures had made her invaluable on trade missions. "Smooth as silk, Doc," Hayes replied with a grin. "This old girl's got a lot of life left in her. You need something." "Just doing my rounds, making sure everyone's healthy and hasn't been breathing in too much drive plasma." She smiled, pulling out her medical scanner to check his vitals. I'm fine. You worry too much." "That's my job, Pat." In the pilot's station at the front of the bridge, Jake Brennan was running through system checks with the kind of casual precision that came from natural talent. At 33, he had the confidence of someone who knew exactly how good he was. Some called it cockiness, but Captain Price called it justified. Brennan could fly the Meridian through an asteroid field blindfolded if he had to. "Captain, I'm picking up something on the long-range sensors," Brennan said, his tone shifting from casual to focused. "Single vessel, cruiser class, heading on an intercept course." Price moved to stand behind Brennan's station, studying the sensor data. "IFF signal, coming in now. It's Krell, sir." A subtle tension filled the bridge. The Krell Dominion had a reputation throughout this region of space. They were expansionist, aggressive, and considered most other species to be inferior. But they generally respected the established trade routes and the laws of the Galactic Commerce Assembly. Generally. "Hail them, Kate. Let's follow protocol." Sullivan opened a communication channel, her voice professional and calm. "Krell vessel, this is the civilian cargo hauler Meridian, registry Terran 7742. We are on a scheduled trade route to New Savannah Colony. Our cargo manifest is available for inspection, and we are operating under the protection of the Galactic Commerce Treaty." For a long moment there was only static. Then a voice responded, harsh and guttural, the universal translator struggling to render the Krell language into something human ears could understand. "Human vessel, you will stop your engines and prepare to be boarded. Your cargo is now property of the Krell Dominion." Price felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. "Krell vessel, we are in neutral space operating under interstellar law. We cannot comply with that request. If you wish to file a formal complaint with the Galactic Commerce Assembly, we will cooperate fully with any legal proceedings." The response was immediate. "You misunderstand, human. This is not a request. Cut your engines now or we will disable your ship." Brennan looked back at the captain, his hands hovering over the helm controls. "Sir," Price considered his options. The Meridian was a cargo hauler, not a warship. They had basic defensive shields and point defense lasers designed to handle space debris, nothing that could stand up to a Krell cruiser. Running would only delay the inevitable and might provoke them into firing immediately. "Send a priority message to the nearest Terran outpost," Price ordered. Include our position, the situation, and the Krell ship's identification codes. Then comply with their demands. Power down the engines. Sullivan's fingers flew across her console, encoding the message and firing it off on a tight beam transmission. Message away, Captain. The Meridian's engines wound down and the ship drifted to a relative stop. On the view screen, the Krell cruiser grew larger, its angular design speaking to a culture that valued intimidation as much as function. It was 3 times the size of the Meridian, bristling with weapon emplacements. "They're locking weapons on us," Brennan reported, his voice tight. "Hold steady." "We're not giving them an excuse." But the excuse didn't matter. A lance of brilliant blue energy shot out from the Krell cruiser, striking the Meridian's engine section. Alarms screamed across the bridge as systems began failing. The ship shuddered and the lights flickered. "Direct hit to the engine room," Sullivan shouted over the alarms. "We've lost main power. Life support is on emergency backup." Price grabbed the edge of Sullivan's console to steady himself. "Damage report. What about Pat?" Sullivan's face went pale as she read her displays. "The engine room took the full force of the blast. Hull breach on decks 3 and 4. I'm not reading any life signs in engineering." The words hit Price like a physical blow. Patrick Hayes, who had been with him since he'd first taken command of the Meridian. Patrick, who could fix anything and always had a joke ready, gone in an instant. "Captain, they're launching boarding pods," Brennan said. Price straightened, pushing down his grief. He still had a crew to protect. "All hands, this is the captain. We are being boarded by hostile forces. Do not resist. I repeat, do not resist. Comply with their orders and stay alive. That's a direct command." He opened a drawer in his command chair and pulled out a small data chip, pressing it into Sullivan's hand. "Take this. It's the ship's log and all our records. Hide it somewhere they won't think to look." "Captain, that's an order, Kate. If we don't make it, someone needs to know what happened here." The next few minutes passed in a blur of violence and noise. The Krell boarding party stormed through the ship with brutal efficiency. They were large creatures, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with 4 arms and thick, scaled hides that could shrug off small arms fire. Not that the Meridian's crew was armed with anything more dangerous than a few emergency pistols. Price and the bridge crew were herded into the main cargo bay at gunpoint. Or rather, at plasma rifle point. The Krell warriors moved with the confidence of beings who had never met serious resistance. The cargo bay was large, designed to hold shipping containers the size of small houses. Now it held the survivors of the Meridian's crew, huddled together under the watchful eyes of their captors. Price did a quick count. 15 out of 23. 8 gone, including Patrick Hayes. One of the Krell stepped forward, larger than the others and decorated with more elaborate armor. The translator chip on its chest crackled to life. "I am War Leader Zethrak. This ship and its cargo are now property of the Krell Dominion. You are prisoners of war." "This is a civilian vessel," Price said, stepping forward despite the weapons trained on him. "We're protected under the Galactic Commerce Treaty. What you've done here is an act of piracy at minimum, an act of war at worst." Zethrak made a sound that might have been laughter. "War requires 2 sides capable of fighting, human. You are merchants playing at exploring the stars. The Dominion has conquered 17 species across 300 years. What are you? A few hundred worlds of soft creatures who prefer talking to acting. You are prey, not predators. You should be grateful we find you useful enough to keep as slaves rather than simply exterminating you." Price felt Sullivan tense beside him, felt the anger radiating from his crew. But he also saw the weapons, saw the cold certainty in the Krell's eyes. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a predator playing with food. "Your government will hear of this," Price said quietly. "Let them hear. Let them cry and complain to their assemblies and councils. The Dominion fears no one, least of all humans who cannot even protect a single cargo ship." Zethrak turned and barked orders in his own language. The Krell warriors began herding the prisoners toward a boarding tube that connected the 2 ships. Price cast one last look at the Meridian, at the ship that had been his home for 6 years, now gutted and broken. "Move, human," one of the Krell growled, shoving him forward with one of its 4 arms. As they crossed into the Krell ship, Price noticed Sullivan's hand move subtly to a pocket in her uniform. She'd hidden the data chip. Small comfort, but it was something. If they survived this, if anyone ever found them, there would be a record of what happened. The Krell cruiser's interior was as brutal as its exterior. Metal grating for floors, exposed conduits running along the walls, everything designed for function with no thought for comfort. They were taken to what appeared to be a cargo hold converted into a holding cell, a space large enough to hold 100 prisoners, but currently containing only the 15 survivors from the Meridian. As the force field snapped into place, sealing them in, Price gathered his crew around him. They were scared, hurt, grieving, but they were alive. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're alive. As long as we're alive, there's hope. We follow their orders, we don't give them any excuse to hurt us, and we wait for an opportunity." "An opportunity for what?" one of the younger crew members asked, her voice shaking. "Captain, they destroyed the ship. They killed Pat and the others like it was nothing." "I know," Price said. "Believe me, I know, but giving up isn't an option." The message got out. Someone knows what happened here. We have to believe that matters. What Price didn't say, what he couldn't say, was his doubt that it would matter. The Krell were right about one thing. Humanity had been peaceful for so long, had worked so hard to move beyond their violent past, that maybe they had grown soft. Maybe this was just the beginning of the Krell deciding humanity was ripe for conquest. He pushed the thought away. Despair was a luxury he couldn't afford. His crew needed him to be strong, to be certain, even if that certainty was a mask over his own fears. The days that followed were brutal in their monotony. The Krell kept them in the holding cell with minimal food and water. They were interrogated repeatedly. The Krell wanting information about human military capabilities, colony locations, trade routes. Price answered what questions he could with information that was already publicly available, protecting anything that might be sensitive. On the 5th day, war leader Zethrak visited their cell personally. He stood outside the force field, all 4 arms crossed over his chest, studying them like specimens in a laboratory. "Your government has responded to our message," he said, his tone suggesting amusement. "They demand your release. They threaten sanctions. They appeal to the Galactic Commerce Assembly. They do everything except what matters. They do not threaten war." "Because we're not a warlike species," Price said. "We prefer diplomacy." "You prefer weakness. In the galaxy there are only predators and prey. You have chosen to be prey. This is the result." "The Galactic Commerce Assembly will do nothing," Zethrak interrupted. "The Assembly is a talk shop for weak species to pretend they have power. The Dominion tolerates it because it is occasionally useful, but we do not fear it. We do not fear you." He leaned closer to the force field, his eyes gleaming with what might have been contempt. "Your species is soft, human. You have forgotten what it means to fight, to struggle, to dominate. The Dominion will teach you your place. You will be the first but not the last. Your colonies, your trade routes, your precious Earth itself. All will bend to the Dominion or break." Price met the Krell's gaze and spoke with a certainty he didn't entirely feel. "You're making a mistake." "Am I? What will your people do, Captain? Write a strongly worded letter." With that, Zethrak walked away, his laughter echoing through the corridors. Kate Sullivan moved to stand beside Price. "Do you think anyone's coming for us?" she asked quietly. Price looked at his crew, at the hope and fear mingled in their eyes. He thought about Patrick Hayes, about the 8 crew members who had died for no reason other than being in the wrong place when the Krell decided to prove a point. "Yes," he said, "I believe someone's coming." What he didn't say was what he truly believed, that by the time anyone came, it might be too late. Far across the void of space, in a secure command center on Earth, the message from the Meridian had arrived. It had been received, analyzed, and immediately escalated to the highest levels of the Terran government. In the council chambers, representatives from every human world gathered via holographic link. The mood was grim as they watched the recording of the Meridian's final transmission, heard Captain Price's calm voice explaining the situation, saw the sensor data showing the unprovoked attack. "This is an act of war," one representative said, his voice shaking with anger. "They attacked a civilian vessel in neutral space. They murdered our people. We must appeal to the Galactic Commerce Assembly," another argued. "Sanctions, embargoes, diplomatic pressure. The Krell don't care about diplomacy," the first representative slammed his hand on the table. "They've made that clear. They see us as weak because we prefer talking to fighting." Maybe it's time we reminded the galaxy why humanity worked so hard to stop fighting each other. The debate raged for hours, with some calling for immediate military action and others advocating for diplomatic solutions. But as more information came in about the Krell's actions, about their broadcasts boasting of how easily they had crushed the human ship, about their threats to expand into human space, the consensus slowly shifted. Commander Gregory Shaw sat in the military observers section, watching and listening. At 52, he was one of the most decorated officers in the Terran Defense Force, a veteran of border skirmishes and anti-piracy operations. He had spent his entire career preparing for a war he had hoped would never come. Now it looked like that hope was about to be disappointed. When the vote came, it was nearly unanimous. The Terran Council invoked Article 7 of the Terran Charter, a clause written 200 years ago and never used. It stated that an unprovoked attack on civilian vessels was an act of war against all of humanity, and authorized whatever response was deemed necessary to protect human lives and interests. The next day, Commander Shaw was promoted to Fleet Commander and given operational authority over the Terran Defense Force. His orders were simple: make the Krell regret attacking the Meridian, retrieve the prisoners if possible, and ensure that no one else would be tempted to view humanity as an easy target. Shaw stood in his office, looking at the star map projected on the wall. The Krell Dominion controlled 17 star systems in this region of space, with military installations, shipyards, and supply depots spread across dozens of worlds. They had a fleet of over 300 warships and ground forces numbering in the millions. The Terran Defense Force had 112 warships and an army that was large by human standards but tiny compared to the Krell military machine. In any conventional war, the Krell would win. They had more ships, more soldiers, more resources. But Shaw had no intention of fighting a conventional war. Humanity had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of warfare before finally deciding to stop pointing that expertise at each other. Every tactic, every strategy, every dirty trick learned in countless wars had been carefully preserved and studied. Not because humanity wanted to use them again, but because they understood that forgetting how to fight was different from choosing not to. Shaw had spent his career studying military history, from ancient Earth battles to the more recent conflicts between alien species. He had learned an important lesson: wars weren't won by the strongest force, but by the smartest, by the side that could adapt, improvise, and exploit weaknesses. The Krell were strong, but they were predictable. They had conquered species that couldn't effectively resist them. They fought with overwhelming force, crushing opposition through sheer power. Humanity would fight differently. Shaw opened a secure communication channel. All fleet commanders, this is Fleet Commander Shaw. Operational orders are being transmitted now. We launch in 72 hours. This is not a police action. This is not a peacekeeping mission. This is war, and we will prosecute it with every tool at our disposal. The objective is not occupation, not conquest. The objective is to dismantle the Krell military capacity and free our people. How we achieve that is up to us, but achieve it we will. Shaw out. He closed the channel and returned his attention to the star map, his mind already racing through possibilities and probabilities. The Krell had made a fatal mistake. They had attacked humanity thinking they understood what humans were capable of. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The war began not with a massive fleet engagement, but with a whisper in the dark. 3 weeks after the attack on the Meridian, a Krell supply depot in the outer territories simply disappeared. One moment it was there, a massive orbital platform supplying 12 warships. The next moment it was debris expanding slowly through space. The Krell investigated, sent more ships, strengthened their defenses at other installations. It didn't matter. 2 days later, a communications relay near Krell space exploded, then a shipyard, then 3 military outposts on the same day. The pattern was clear. Humanity was striking fast and hard at soft targets, never staying in one place long enough to be caught. The Krell tried to respond, sending their warships to hunt the human raiders, but human ships were smaller, faster, and used tactics the Krell had never encountered. In one engagement, a squadron of human frigates faced off against a Krell battle group. The Krell expected a conventional battle, ship against ship, the kind of fight they had won hundreds of times before. Instead, the human ships scattered, using asteroids and debris for cover, launching missiles, and then jumping away before the return fire could reach them. The Krell gave chase, certain they could corner and destroy the human ships. They walked straight into a minefield that the humans had deployed hours earlier and then abandoned. 3 Krell cruisers were destroyed before they realized what was happening. Jake Brennan, who had been rescued in a daring raid on the Krell prison ship where the Meridian's crew was held, was back in a cockpit. But now he was flying a military fighter, part of a squadron tasked with harassment operations. "This is Ranger 3 to Ranger Lead," he spoke into his comm. "I've got visual on the target, Krell Fuel Depot, exactly where intelligence said it would be. Copy that, Ranger 3. All units, weapons free. Hit them fast and get out. We've got 30 seconds before their patrol returns." The human fighters streaked in, moving too fast for the depot's automated defenses to track effectively. They launched their missiles and were gone before the explosions even registered on sensors. Behind them, the fuel depot erupted in a chain reaction that would be visible from 3 star systems away. On the ground, the war was even more one-sided. Human Special Forces teams infiltrated Krell-occupied worlds, not to conquer them, but to create chaos. They freed prisoners, including the species the Krell had subjugated over their 300 years of expansion. They sabotaged infrastructure, destroyed supply lines, and disappeared before the Krell could respond. The Krell, who had built their entire military doctrine around overwhelming force and direct confrontation, had no answer for an enemy that refused to fight on those terms. But the real turning point came at the Battle of Krell Prime. Fleet Commander Shaw assembled the largest concentration of human warships since the formation of the Terran Defense Force. 53 capital ships, twice that many support vessels, and enough fighters to blot out the stars. He took this massive fleet and pointed it directly at the Krell homeworld. The Krell couldn't believe their luck. Finally, the humans were fighting properly, meeting them in open battle. They pulled ships from across their empire, gathering their strength at Krell Prime to meet this threat. This would be the decisive battle, the one that would prove Krell's superiority once and for all. War leader Zethrak was given command of the defense. He stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the human fleet approach. "At last," he growled to his officers. "At last they come to face us like warriors instead of scurrying like insects. We will crush them here and then finish what we started." The human species will learn the price of defying the Dominion. The human fleet came closer, close enough that the battle seemed inevitable. The Krell locked weapons, prepared their ships for the glorious battle to come, and then the human fleet jumped away, all of them in perfect synchronization, vanishing into faster-than-light travel as if they had never been there. Zethrak stood in confused fury, unable to understand what had just happened. Find them. Where did they go? The answer came an hour later, as reports flooded in from across the Krell Empire. While the main Krell fleet had concentrated at their homeworld, human task forces had struck at every other major military installation simultaneously. Shipyards, supply depots, command centers, all of them hit in a coordinated assault that showed the kind of planning and execution that came from a species that had spent millennia learning to fight. In 72 hours, the Krell Dominion lost more than half their military infrastructure. Their subject species, seeing that the Krell could be beaten, began to rebel. Entire worlds declared independence. The Dominion, which had seemed unshakable, began to fracture. And through it all, the human forces continued their relentless assault, dismantling the military machine that the Krell had built over 3 centuries. Back on the Krell prison ship, Captain Price and his crew had watched these developments with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The guards were becoming nervous, their movements less certain. Prisoners from other species whispered to each other in corners, talking about the humans who had come like demons from the dark to tear down the mighty Krell. "Did you know they would do this?" Dr. Lisa Morgan asked Price one evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you know humanity was capable of this?" Price thought about the question, about the history he had studied in school. The wars, the weapons, the casual cruelty that humans had once inflicted on each other. All of that set aside, locked away, chosen to be forgotten in favor of building something better. I knew we could fight, he said. I just hoped we'd never have to prove it. Kate Sullivan was working on something in the corner of their cell, using components she had scavenged from various places around the prison. Captain, if I'm right about the guard rotations and the power distribution in this section, I think I can get us out of here. That's risky, Kate. So is sitting here waiting to see if we're valuable as hostages or liabilities to be eliminated. The Krell are losing, Captain. Desperate people do desperate things. She was right, and Price knew it. All right, what do you need? Over the next few days, Sullivan worked on her plan while the other prisoners created distractions, drawing the guards' attention away from what she was doing. Dr. Morgan spread the word among the other prisoners, not just humans but the dozens of other species the Krell had captured over the years. If we're getting out, we're taking everyone who wants to come, Price said. Finally, on the day that reports came in that human forces were approaching the prison ship's location, Sullivan made her move. Using a jury-rigged electromagnetic pulse device built from spare parts, she overloaded the power coupling for their cell's force field. The field flickered and died. Alarms immediately began blaring throughout the ship, but Price and his crew were already moving. They overwhelmed the guards closest to their position, seizing their weapons. More prisoners joined them, a growing wave of rebellion spreading through the ship. When the human boarding party breached the hull, they found the prisoners had already taken control of half the ship. Commander Shaw was with the boarding party, and he made his way to where Price and the other Meridian survivors had gathered. "Captain Daniel Price," he asked. "That's me." Shaw extended his hand. "Commander Gregory Shaw, Terran Defense Force. We're here to bring you home." Price shook his hand, feeling the weight of the past month settling on his shoulders. Patrick Hayes didn't make it. "My chief engineer. He was in the engine room when the Krell attacked. 8 others died too." "I know. We recovered the bodies from the wreckage of the Meridian. They've been returned to their families with full honors." Price felt his throat tight. "What happens now?" Shaw gestured to the viewports where more human ships could be seen among the stars. "Now we finish this. The Krell Dominion is falling apart. Their subject species are in open revolt. Their military is shattered. War Leader Zethrak, the one who ordered the attack on your ship, is in custody. He'll face trial for war crimes." "And then what? We occupy Krell space, become conquerors ourselves." "No," Shaw said firmly. "That's not who we are. We dismantle their military, make sure they can't threaten anyone else, and then we leave. The Krell and their former subjects can figure out their own futures. Our job is to make sure they do it without threatening others." The trial of War Leader Zethrak was held on neutral ground at a space station operated by the Galactic Commerce Assembly. Representatives from dozens of species attended, watching as the Krell, who had once seemed invincible, stood in chains before a tribunal. Captain Price was called to testify. He stood before the assembled dignitaries and told his story. The peaceful cargo run that had become a nightmare. The unprovoked attack. The murder of his crew members. The brutal captivity that followed. When he finished, Zethrak was given a chance to speak. The Krell stood tall, even in chains, and addressed the court in his harsh voice. "I followed the ways of the Dominion. We are warriors. We take what we can hold. This is the way of the strong. If the humans were weak, that is not my fault." Price asked if he could respond. The tribunal granted permission. "You're right," Price said, his voice carrying across the silent chamber. "We were weak. We had a ship full of medical supplies meant to heal people, and we couldn't defend it against your warship. But here's what you didn't understand. We chose to be that way. Humanity spent thousands of years fighting each other, perfecting every possible way to kill and destroy. We got very, very good at it. So good that we nearly destroyed ourselves. We decided to be better. We chose mercy over strength, diplomacy over domination. Not because we couldn't fight, but because we remembered what fighting cost." He took a step closer to Zethrak. "You attacked a ship carrying medicine and killed people who meant you no harm. You thought that made you strong. In return, humanity dismantled an empire that had stood for 300 years. We did it in weeks. Not because we wanted to, but because you forced us to remember things we had tried to forget. You mistook our kindness for weakness. That was your fatal error. Price turned to address the broader assembly. We didn't want this war. Every human life lost, every Krell ship destroyed, every world thrown into chaos, we wish none of it had happened. But you need to understand something. Humanity will go to extraordinary lengths to avoid war. We'll negotiate compromise, even accept unfair terms if it means preserving peace. But once you force war upon us, once you prove that peace isn't possible, we will end that war decisively. Not with occupation, not with conquest, but by ensuring that whoever started it can never threaten anyone again. The tribunal found Zethrak guilty of war crimes, including the murder of civilian crews and the illegal seizure of vessels in neutral space. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, and the Krell Dominion was ordered to pay massive reparations to the families of those killed and enslaved. But the formal punishment was almost irrelevant. The Dominion was already gone, fractured into dozens of independent states as their former subjects claimed freedom. The Krell themselves faced a choice: join the galactic community as equals, following the same laws as everyone else, or face isolation and extinction. Most chose integration. The warrior culture that had defined them for so long began to shift, slowly and painfully, as they learned to exist in a galaxy that would no longer tolerate their aggression. The Meridian was rebuilt. It took 6 months and the work of the best engineers humanity had to offer. When it was finished, it looked almost exactly as it had before, a functional cargo hauler designed for reliability over flash. But its hull was now inscribed with names: Patrick Hayes and the 7 others who had died in the attack. Captain Price stood at the dedication ceremony, watching as the names were unveiled. Representatives from every human world attended, along with delegations from many of the alien species who had been freed when the Krell Dominion fell. They were merchants, Price said during his speech. Traders bringing supplies to a colony world. They weren't soldiers, weren't looking for glory or conquest. They were just doing their jobs, following the trade routes that connected our worlds. And they died because someone mistook our peaceful nature for an inability to fight back. He looked out at the assembled crowd. We rebuilt this ship as a memorial, but also as a promise. Humanity will always prefer peace, will always seek the diplomatic solution, the negotiated settlement. But what happened to the Meridian and what came after should serve as a reminder to anyone tempted to test that preference. We choose peace not because we can't wage war, but because we know all too well what war costs. Push us far enough, force us to set aside our better nature, and we will respond with every tool and trick we've learned from thousands of years of fighting each other. We don't want to be that species again, but we will be if we must. The ceremony ended, and the Meridian prepared for its first post-reconstruction voyage. Price assembled his crew, most of them the same people who had survived the attack. Kate Sullivan was still his first officer, Jake Brennan back at the helm after his stint in the military. Dr. Lisa Morgan had returned to her role as ship's doctor, though she had new scars, both visible and otherwise. There was a new chief engineer, a young woman named Amy Porter, fresh out of the academy. She stood in the engine room that Patrick Hayes had given his life defending, and she understood the weight of the responsibility she was taking on. "Captain, we're ready to depart," Sullivan reported from the bridge. "Set course for New Savannah," Price ordered. "Let's finish the run we started." As the Meridian pulled away from the dock, it passed a memorial beacon that marked the spot where the original ship had been attacked. The crew observed a moment of silence, each of them remembering the friends they had lost, the innocence that had been taken from them. Then they turned their attention forward, to the stars ahead and the cargo hold full of medical supplies, agricultural equipment, and trade goods. The same mission they had started all those months ago, before everything changed. The galaxy had learned a hard lesson. Humanity had been forced to teach it, at a cost they would have preferred never to pay. But the lesson had been learned and remembered. Other species looked at human merchant ships differently now. The civilian vessels that plied the trade routes, carrying goods between worlds, were no longer seen as soft targets. Everyone knew what had happened when someone made that mistake. Humanity returned to what it did best: building, trading, exploring, creating. The Terran Defense Force scaled back to pre-war levels, and the warriors who had prosecuted the campaign against the Krell returned to their peacetime duties. Commander Shaw, now Admiral Shaw, oversaw the drawdown with the same precision he had brought to the war itself. In his office, he kept a holographic image of the Meridian, the original ship before the attack. It served as a reminder of why he did what he did, and what the cost of failure would be. In the Galactic Commerce Assembly, new treaties were signed, new protections for civilian vessels put in place. The Krell sat at the table as equals now, not overlords. They had learned humility the hard way, and most of them were working, slowly and painfully, to build something new from the ruins of their old empire. On the Meridian, Captain Price sat in his command chair, watching the stars stream by on the view screen. Kate Sullivan was at her navigation console, Jake Brennan at the helm, Dr. Morgan making her rounds, Amy Porter keeping the engines running smoothly. They were just a merchant ship on a routine cargo run, bringing supplies to worlds that needed them. Peaceful, unheroic work that formed the backbone of interstellar civilization. And if sometimes, late at night, Price thought about those terrible weeks as a prisoner, or the friends who hadn't made it home, or the war that humanity had waged with such terrible efficiency, he reminded himself why it had been necessary. The Krell had attacked a human ship, thinking they understood what humanity was. They learned they were wrong. And the lesson had spread far enough, been remembered clearly enough, that Price hoped it would never need to be taught again. "Captain," Sullivan said, breaking into his thoughts, "we're approaching New Savannah. They're hailing us. They're saying they've been waiting for this delivery for a long time." Price smiled just a little. "Tell them we had some delays, but we always finish our deliveries. Take us in, Jake." "Aye, Captain." The Meridian descended toward the colony world, its cargo holds full of hope and healing, its hull bearing the names of those who had died so that others could live in peace. It was a merchant ship, crewed by ordinary people doing ordinary work. But everyone who saw it pass knew its story. They knew what it represented, what it had cost, and what humanity would do to protect vessels like it. One act of violence had rippled across an entire region of space, toppling an empire and reshaping the galactic order. The Krell had thought attacking a human ship would demonstrate their strength. Instead, it had ended everything they had built and taught the galaxy a lesson they would not soon forget. Humanity preferred peace, worked tirelessly for it, sacrificed for it. But peace was a choice, not a limitation. And those who forced humanity to make a different choice learned, too late, just how terrible that choice could be.